let me welcome you all to the Independent Outlook, a conversation that comes to you every other week, roughly, from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We are situated across the bay from San Francisco and try and bring you an unpredictable and principled view of many of the events of the day in this conversation. We also thank our partners at ThinkSpot for helping us to get this word out to friends around the country and even overseas. In the Independent Outlook today, I am joined by my colleagues Williamson Evers and David Theroux. Williamson Evers is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence, and we are grateful to have you leading the way in that part of our work. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
And of course, David Theroux is the founder and president of the Independent Institute. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And I'm Graham Walker. I'm the executive director. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some of the things that are catching attention in this week's news. Let's just say, friends, that there's no lack of things to talk about. So much, in fact, that I could hardly decide where to begin, except let me just begin at the most recently breaking news that really caught my attention. I think probably caught a bunch of other people's attention too. The New York Post just published a piece documenting email exchanges between Hunter Biden and his contacts in the Ukraine, where he was setting up meetings between his father, the vice president, and officials at Burisma, the government-connected organization, energy organization, which suggests that some of the things that Joe Biden has said may not be quite as precisely accurate as he originally said. I'm looking at this thing, which is where the guy from Burisma, his name is Vadim Pozdziarski, says, "Dear Hunter, thank you for inviting me to D.C. and giving me an opportunity to meet your father and spent some time together. It's realty and honor and pleasure." So what's fascinating about this is that the Biden campaign has said that, Vice President Biden never spoke to his son about his business dealings in Ukraine. But this looks like maybe not quite the case. He said he never met with the guy from Burisma. Well, that may be, but they were talking about a meeting at the very least. And most interesting to me, the Biden campaign did not deny the accuracy of the contents of the email. Even more interesting is what Facebook and Twitter have done. You gentlemen probably know a little bit about Facebook and Twitter's response. David, can you narrate for our friends what Facebook did with this information?
Well, they essentially claimed, based on their no hacking policy, that they would not post any notices about this development, this news. The New York Post article would not be posted.
And then Twitter followed their lead, designating the information unsafe for its viewers and preventing any of its subscribers from reposting the material. And so, one of the editors of the New York Post, Arabi, I think is his name, isn't it? Sohrab Ahmari, sorry. He said this is digital civil war. This is big tech info coup. And he says, I, an editor at the New York Post, one of the nation's largest papers by circulation, can't post one of our own stories concerning a major party presidential candidate on Twitter. Pretty weird. What's your take on this, Bill? It's hard to decipher.
Well, I think, these are private companies and they are limiting what they're posting. I think they're wrong-headed about it and it's going to damage their reputation. I think there's an ongoing debate. There's some question as to whether any such meeting ever was on the Vice President Biden's schedule.
Mm-hmm.
There's some question. Apparently the Post did not phone Biden or the Biden campaign, to try and check on any of the facts in this. I mean, I presume they thought they were having a scoop and they didn't want anyone else to get ahead of the story, but that's also a defect in the story until it gets remedied. It's also a very, very unusual story about how this material came to light. So supposedly, and I think, in these sorts of things, we have to keep a skeptical eye, but we also have to think, could this have happened? I think it could have. So supposedly a computer was brought in for repair from water damage.
In Joe Biden's hometown in Delaware.
Yes. And it had a sticker on the side having to do with the Beau Biden Foundation, which is the the deceased son of the president, vice president, sorry. You want to be president. And so the repairman saw what was inside it, and he found various things, and included these materials, and it was taken by the FBI, but before that, he made a copy of the material that was in there. And so this is the apparent source of this, but of course it's a very roundabout thing, and it's sort of puzzling why no one ever tried to reclaim the computer. But we're going to find out more. I think, in my mind, I think we should be skeptical about the story, but I think we should certainly be looking at this, and in Congress, the committees in Congress are looking at it, and I don't know.
Senator Hawley from Missouri has already written a letter to Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook complaining about the bias. What do you think, David, about all this?
Yeah, well, there's a number of pieces to it, as Bill is suggesting. I do think that the evidence does look pretty conclusive that this was either Hunter Biden's computer or one that he was associated with. And the indication that we have apparently is the FBI is not denying any of this. The Biden campaign and associates are not denying any of it. And Twitter and Facebook are not claiming that it's erroneous. They're claiming it was hacking. So that also is pretty telling. So no one is denying it's not true.
And I think everybody, even the defenders of the Biden campaign, are acknowledging that Hunter Biden got that job in the Ukraine solely so that he could have, those companies could have leverage with the United States government.
That's right.
And even Jonathan Chait, other people that are Vox that are defending the Biden campaign in this dispute are acknowledging that this was not a job that the man got on his merits or because he was adding real productivity to the companies.
Well, Joe Biden said he was hired because Hunter was a very bright guy.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of bright guys in the world, but only one that's the son of the vice president who is involved in the whole issue and threatened the Ukrainian government accordingly. So, I mean, there are conspiracy theories, but you also can connect the dots when the evidence seems to suggest something.
There are theories that are not evidentially backed, and there are real conspiracies. And it's a question of the evidence. And
that's right.
We should be open to the evidence, but we should also be careful.
Right. And so the report that the Senate Republicans did, this 87-page report, outlines a lot of Hunter Biden's goings-on in Russia and China and London with his partner and so on.
I think the three of us agree that's an excellent report.
Right. It's an excellent report, and this is just another indication that the Bidens are covering it up and there's something really there, and it definitely looks like significant cronyism within the Biden family.
I will also say, though, if it turns out that this is manufactured evidence, it will look very bad for the people associated with it.
That's true.
Yeah, that is for sure.
Right. I'm actually surprised that the Republican report hasn't gone further, and I think the reason is simply because they couldn't get bipartisan support for it.
Right. The committee had said we're not getting a satisfactory cooperation.
So it wasn't as if there wasn't enough there. It's politics.
Well, regarding this New York Post report of the email exchanges with Hunter Biden and so forth, I don't know whether they're accurate or manufactured or not, but what I just really find telling is the fact that Facebook and Twitter, whether they knew it was false or not, they decided their first reaction was going to be to squelch it.
Yes, that's right.
even apparently in Facebook's case, they preempted their normal fact checker, neutral evaluator process and made the decision to block the material before that group could weigh in.
That's right. And so, the suspicions are piling up, and it's, as Bill was saying, it doesn't lend credibility to the judgment or the reliability of these tech platforms. But I think that and of course the fear is this could really undermine Biden's chance. They've been hiding him away, not just literally at his home, but the rallies, so-called rallies that he has for like 20 people, are all choreographed. And so the theory is that they're going to essentially prolong the inability of his being answerable to questions, and that would be sufficient to make him win. So something like this is a wrench that they can't afford.
It seems to me that when these tech platforms respond to this kind of information in this preemptive way, I'm not saying they're breaking the law, but I am saying that their protestations about being objective, neutral, and so forth kind of ring hollow when this follows on so many other instances of high tech seeming to be pretty much devoted to its own view of the world, politically speaking.
It's not just their own view, Graham. It's where their bread is buttered.
Mm-hmm.
Their bread is buttered because most of these companies have huge contracts with the federal government.
I think there's another problem, and that is as these regulatory efforts of these companies grow, they become politically more sensitive.
That's right.
So let's say they're looking at the polls, and let's say the polls, even though they're pretty close in a lot of the battleground states, but let's say the polls that say Biden's going to win the presidency are right. And let's say Facebook and Twitter just treat themselves as platforms and more or less let whatever gets posted get posted. So now we're in this situation where you have all these Democratic legislators who want to have federally regulated truth commissions governing these electronic media, and you possibly have a President Biden in the White House, and you possibly have an attack on his son that whatever he believes is false or maybe he is true. I mean, after all, a true accusation is the most damaging one, right? So they're in a bad situation. I mean, the real source from, I think, my point of view is that this regulation of speech by government and the threat of it is going to mean that the electronic media freedom that we've seen in the last years, we may look back at this as a golden age, however the bad side of it is.
We may.
And whether it's coming from the right or the left, we're going to have a terrible, intrusive regulatory regime from the federal government.
I think that's definitely true, but I think the key is does any particular firm or a particular industry benefit from special privileges? And the idea would be to remove those privileges and not to regulate them in a way that they could then capture the regulators and create a new mercantilist system. But certainly, if the CIA can privatize surveillance and not be accountable, it will do it. Doesn't mean that surveillance is okay. Okay.
I'd just say, maybe as a last word on this particular subject, the only group that I would trust less than government-enabled big tech would be government-enabled government.
Right. But I think the main issue we're talking about here is whether Biden lied and whether there really is corruption that shows what Biden is about. And I think that's an important thing to explore.
Looking back to last week, gentlemen, that vice presidential candidate debate. I mean, wow, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall there to hear what they... Oh, wait a minute. I don't think I'd want to be the fly on Mike Pence's head.
I don't want to be a fly, period.
Poor guy, he had no idea. I mean, he said his daughter told him afterwards, and of course, in a way, it was like the one sort of friendly piece of information that came out of that, because people were joking about it. I mean, it really wasn't at his expense. He didn't do anything wrong. People just had something to laugh about, at least. Let's just say that it sure felt more civilized than the debate between the presidential candidates. Do you have any comments on this, Bill Evers?
I do. I think the Vice President Pence pretty well shone a spotlight on the tax burden that is going to come if Biden administration were to get in office. So we're talking about a $3 trillion tax increase over the next decade. That's a lot. It would diminish the product of the American economy. They have explicitly said they're going to repeal the Trump-era tax cuts, and the Biden people are, at a minimum, being deceptive in hinting that, middle-class people are not going to face any additional taxes because of that. And they're also going to roll back the regulatory relief that has come during the Trump era. I think, Vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris told a fib about Abraham Lincoln and the nomination of Salmon P. Chase to the Supreme Court. That was kind of a little story she had, but it was not true historically. That Congress wasn't in session, so there was no way that the president was going to be putting a nomination in, and besides, he had a certain kind of practice of soliciting advice on it. But as soon as Congress was in session, he put in Salmon P. Chase and was immediately ratified. The court packing evasion was just unbelievably present there.
Stunning.
Andrew McCarthy of the National Review said that the Biden-Harris administration would blow up the separation of powers part of separation of powers equilibrium in the American constitutional system, and that's would not be a healthy thing. So I think it was because it was calm and because it was just they let the different statements get out there, we got a better picture of where the two sides were, and I think for those Americans who were watching it, they got a better idea of what the future of the country might be.
I also think that it showed the two different strategies that the campaigns have. Firstly, everything that Harris was asked, or in an exchange with Pence, she then defaulted to coronavirus, the pandemic. Right. She also has a tendency, and it's not just this time, but in the Democratic primary debates and in her career, she defaults to being a victim. Yeah. And so that's her way out. And so she here's Pence asking a legitimate question, and she then scolds him, essentially.
Yeah.
And I think that the setting of the whole debate itself, Susan Page is a liberal.
Right. She never asked a question that tilted conservative or libertarian.
Exactly.
Never.
They're all basically Democratic talking point perspectives. And one of her other failings was that when either they didn't answer the question or they did answer the question, she would not follow up with another question. She would just go on to her outline.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think she pretty much was a failure. But I do think that the arrogance and the posturing of Harris was a great contrast to Pence, who was very measured, he was calm, he was composed, he was presidential, essentially.
Yep.
And he was a little wooden, maybe.
Yeah, but
no more than usual.
And the other thing about the fly issue, I should mention, is that with a presidential debate was, a shouting match in many respects, right, started by Biden by the way, when he was interrupting Trump. And Chris Wallace pretty much discredited himself the way he handled all that. But since that was so raucous, this was very calm. It was really a more traditional kind of debate. And I think the pundits were bored. They wanted action. They wanted, something.
They wanted blood on the floor.
Right. So the fly was what was important.
That was all they had.
It's not the court packing. It's not the taxes. It's not.
That's the fly.
All these. It's the fly. Right. And on top of it, Pence is completely composed when he has a fly in his head.
Yeah.
Right.
So not only does she play the victim all the time, which I think David captured very well, but she's actually a victimizer. And in a sense,
right.
Vice President Pence pointed this out, because in her record as Attorney General, she never did a thing for criminal justice reform in California when she was Attorney General here.
Yeah.
And when she was in the U.S. Senate, she really didn't lift a finger, as he said, for the First Step Act. And not only that, and as David has correctly pointed out, they're bringing everything back to public health and Obamacare and coronavirus and so forth. But she, again, did scare tactics with regard to a vaccine, which is extremely destructive of a science-based approach to public policy. And, the president has nothing to do with vaccine approval. There's a body of the FDA on biologics evaluation and research, and that center makes a decision. The people there are not presidential people. And she was just panic mongering. It was very ugly.
Now, I do think that Pence made a mistake in not answering the question about pre-existing conditions. Now, maybe he and the Trump campaign don't know how to answer it. I don't know. We do at Independent Institute. We have specific proposals that deal with that, which doesn't involve some centralized planning of healthcare through what they're proposing through Medicare for All, or even Obamacare, or much of anything the government would be involved in healthcare. So I think that was a big mistake. But I do think that his being more measured, especially when, as you're mentioning, Bill, he raised the question about her track record as a prosecutor and so on, and the hypocrisy of it. And she was definitely floored by that, and she lost her cool. And there was a number of times when she really lost her cool and lost and then she would fall back on either the pandemic issue or, essentially in not so many words, but claiming that Pence is mansplaining or something. And that's essential, and that's what the media picked up on. So Pence being measured and courteous and all the rest of it, but being direct, it's an insult to women that a woman cannot hold her own. I think this is a direct contrast to the behavior of Amy Coney Barrett in the current Senate hearings, where she is cool and calm and brilliant and is steady, and it comes across. And she's a solid person.
Man, does it ever. I mean, you compare the Kavanaugh hearings with these Amy Coney Barrett hearings, it's almost like night and day. And, to be fair, it's not just because of Amy Coney Barrett's poise and intelligence. It's because the Democrats are feeling a little cowed at the moment because they know that they brutalized Mr. Kavanaugh, and they can't afford to brutalize this articulate woman. So they're being a little more careful, but, they're just pushing and pushing and pushing. I mean, at one point, I saw a part of the discussion where she apparently was answering a question about non-discrimination law or something, and she happened to use the term sexual preference. And boy, oh man, apparently that's a no-no word now because that implies that your sexual feelings or inclinations are a choice, a preference, and she said she wasn't trying to weigh in on that one way or the other, but she just pressed the wrong ideological button, and they were displeased with her, and they were displeased with her too. I think when she said that the meaning of the Constitution doesn't change over time. You know, when I heard her say that, I was shocked, just shocked to think that a jurist in the 21st century could still think that the meaning of the Constitution doesn't change over time. But I mean, you know, if the meaning of the Constitution changed over time, then that would mean it wasn't really a constitution. It was just like a leveraging motif, so the dominant views can win.
The argument for the living Constitution is to say that all contracts can change their meaning, and the words can, you know, the word property and everything in a contract is up for grabs depending on how you subjectively evaluate it. But I thought her best moment was when she was holding up her.
Yeah, exactly. Oh,
unbelievable.
Right. And so for someone who's that smart, especially when, you know, they're discussing something in the range of, I don't know, 600 court cases, and so they pick one, and she knows the details of it.
It's amazing, isn't it? It is just amazing. I thought another thing about the debate, I know we're mostly past the debate, but neither of them wanted to answer the question about presidential disability.
Yes.
And then right after that, Nancy Pelosi brings the topic up.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people are divided whether this is an attack on Trump or it's a preemptive thing so that they're ready if Biden were to become president, how they could shift him out and put Kamala Harris in there.
Yeah, it could swing either way.
It's speculation, but I thought it was rather odd for her to press this forward.
Yeah, and then the Republican candidate, who's now a congressman from Georgia, forget his name, has now submitted a bill to impeach Nancy Pelosi for incompetence.
Of course, the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee were not happy with her also when she said, Amy Coney Barrett said, that she did not, in fact, regard Roe versus Wade as a super precedent, but that didn't mean that she was going to pronounce her views one way or the other on how she would rule when it comes before her as a justice. She was careful not to do that. But the simple fact that she didn't regard it as a super precedent was deeply offensive, apparently.
Well, she could have also raised, although it would have changed the discussion, but she could have asked them in response, is the Electoral College a super precedent? Is the First Amendment a first precedent?
Mm-hmm.
And so on. And is the Second Amendment a super precedent?
Well, her answer on that particular point was really quite neat, I thought. I mean, she simply said that when she had written or talked previously about its not being a super precedent, she was speaking in an actual objective, descriptive sense. That is to say, court cases that are so widely accepted that there is no significant body of opinion in the country contesting them, such as Brown versus Board of Education. She said, I'm simply making a descriptive observation. Right. And it's obviously the case that Roe v. Wade has not attained that status of complete acceptance across the board in American public life. So, I mean,
given the fact she's being asked all these questions.
Our listeners, viewers, might be interested in sort of the three big interpretive approaches that conservatives and libertarians have toward the Constitution. So, one is sort of what we might call legislative deference. So this is the view that Felix Frankfurter put forward, and this is the view that unless it's explicitly stated in the Constitution, Congress can do whatever it wants. Okay. So I think the three of us would disagree with that. And the second is the one that Amy Coney Barrett has, which is textualism. And as David was likening to the situation in a contract, the idea is to treat the Constitution as a document like a contract, okay? And so the original public meaning of the words in it are what you go by. And the third position, it could be called a natural right, natural law interpretation. So it doesn't get rid of legislation by Congress. It doesn't get rid of the meaning of the original meaning of the Constitution. But when it By the way, all of these people have a little piece of the other in them.
Of course, yeah. It's not mechanical.
So Senator Coons was questioning her, and she said, well, muskets, we don't have muskets anymore. Now we have high-powered weapons, and so the Second Amendment isn't relevant anymore. Well, okay, so an interpretation that pays attention to the text would also say, okay, so we don't have printing presses exactly like in 1789. They didn't have movies, they didn't have radio, they didn't have television, they certainly didn't have the internet. But we can look at these instrumentalities and the purposes rooted in the natural rights of human beings that are right there in the Declaration of Independence are a way to extend the meaning without just saying anything goes, without being a complete progressive type living constitution where you say, well, whatever is politically faddish, that's how we're going to interpret the Constitution. So that might be the position of Clint Bolick, and certainly Clarence Thomas has some tendencies in this direction.
And where would Scalia be on your tripartite?
Scalia's in the Amy Coney Barrett.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
But he did have elements in the latter, too.
Sure, because as I said, they all have a place for a bit of each other's position.
But I would just like to point out that when Amy Coney Barrett says that she is devoted to, as a judge, devoted to making decisions in accordance with the law, not in accordance with her own beliefs, preferences, and values, a lot of people, especially on the left, seem to take that kind of statement as so much throwaway verbiage, like she's lying or something. But I think it's important to understand that a properly constitutionalist view of judging actually is in some ways dependent upon that distinction between simply implementing what you think is true justice versus what the law says. I mean, I think legal positivism is partly true in the sense that when a judge is acting in his or her capacity as a judge, he or she, in this case, has to make judgments in accordance with what the law was stipulated to be, not what she would like it to be, and not what she thinks true justice necessarily requires, because the law is what the lawmakers, the people in the Constitution, what they intended it to be is what it is, even if the people fell short in their understanding of what true justice really ought to require. So
the question I love to ask the textualists is, well, what about the passage in the Constitution where all debts have to be paid in gold or silver? And please explain your adherence to the originalist meaning of that.
Right.
Well, that doesn't seem so hard.
If you start that bill, you'll find a whole series of
well, Bork admitted that he stepped away from his actual proclaimed position on that clause.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the other big subject of discussion with Amy Coney Barrett, of course, was the Affordable Care Act. And the Democrats seem to have decided that that is primarily where they want to focus their attention in their interviews with her.
Well, it's not just that. They're focusing the attention of their whole campaign.
Yeah.
Right. They're
David
making
is completely right.
Mm-hmm.
And David is pointing out that was in the debate, the VP debate, and it's in this, and it's in their pictures of people with various maladies. The best answer to this was the devastating 2000 Saturday Night Live parody of the Gore George W. Bush debate, where the Gore character has an elderly woman with 95 different ailments, and and my plan will cover her expenses, and George W. Bush's plan will burn her house to the ground.
Man, oh man.
Yeah.
So, I don't think that her vote is really that predictable on the ACA.
Right.
There's a complex set of issues, and the case is going to be argued in the first week of November. And it really isn't obvious, even to me who have studied her.
It's not obvious to me either. And I think I would not at all be surprised if this particular lawsuit does not succeed And if people who are considered libertarian or conservative on the court do not vote to overturn based on this suit. So I think, these partisan Democrats are just tooting their horn for election purposes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because their staff certainly understands the same things we do, that it's a very complicated case and it's not obvious how she would vote.
But okay, so talking about health, let's turn the page just slightly here and talk about the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. I was stunned to see, was it this week or just last week, David, when the World Health Organization issued a new statement regarding its position on how nations should respond to the threat with respect to opening or closing or lockdown or not lockdown. It seemed that the WHO's new statement actually is a shift in their position, is it not?
It's essentially a reversal.
And this was an official statement from the World Health Organization.
Right.
In which they said that lockdowns were much more problematic than first realized and that they have the worst effect on the poorest of the poor.
That's right. And the WHO envoy made that all very clear. When the World Health Organization originally made its claims, which I believe was last February, March, roughly, the US and all these other countries followed suit. And that was combined with the projections of these different models in England and then later at the University of Washington, which scared the bejeebies out of the people, including Trump and everybody else. And we now know those models are totally bogus. Incidentally, the woman who showed that the British model was unfounded is an epidemiologist at Oxford University by the name of Gupta. So she and two other world-class epidemiologists, one from Harvard, one from Stanford, drew up the Great Barrington Declaration.
Was that because they were in Great Barrington, Rhode Island when they did it?
They were in Massachusetts.
Okay.
And that was then signed by 35 other world-class scientists, which was essentially saying that the entire approach that's been used by the CDC and WHO and all these others is totally wrong, and that it's harming people in horrific ways. It has little or nothing to do with the science. It is a serious problem and needs to be ended immediately. So that was released on October 4th. The World Health Organization's reversal was on October 10th, I believe.
Wow.
And so I suspect that the receipt of this declaration was too much for the WHO to stomach. And I suspect some of the people who advised the WHO had a hand in pushing them to retract. This particular declaration has now been signed by something over 9,000 scientists worldwide.
This is the Great Barrington Declaration.
Right, and something like 22 or 23,000 medical practitioners, 200,000 or 300,000, I've lost track, other people. So it's got a huge amount of traction, and it goes completely against what the line of the Biden-Harris campaign is. And what Biden has been talking about is that if his so-called scientific advisors say to shut it down, he'll shut down the entire economy again.
But I thought that if you believed in the science, then you believed in shutdowns. But these are scientists.
Well, the reality of it is that people like Anthony Fauci and these others have a track record of being public health administrators, which does not mean that they know the science. And beyond that, they don't understand economic science or many other aspects of public policy, and have done enormous harm.
To be clear, David, the Great Barrington Declaration, it's addressing these undifferentiated lockdown policies. That's what they're objecting to.
It's not just the lockdown policies. They're basically saying that everything that we know from the very beginning is that the COVID-19 problem, it affects people who are at high risk, the elderly with comorbidities, not the youth, not most people at all, They want to get people exposed to COVID-19, or at least the coronavirus, to develop herd immunity. They believe that the scaremongering is producing record suicides and all sorts of other problems, serious health problems. The people who should be going into hospitals and other medical facilities for cancer examinations and treatments and you name it, has been postponed for months, seriously threatening those people, undermining the financial status of hospitals themselves. And it just goes on and on. And so they're really challenging that whole paradigm upon which the lockdowns were about and what everybody's been talking about, except the best scientists.
I just wanted to add slight nuance to this. So I would say the scientists that wrote this are not advocating a policy that would somehow hop up and speed up the road to population immunity. They are focused instead on preventative measures that would focus prevention on preventing the vulnerable people that David just described from getting the disease. Eventually, we will get to population immunity, but they are not trying to speed that up somehow. And
no, Bill, they're saying that the lockdowns has slowed it down. That's part of what they're saying.
Well, but they're not saying you should stop washing your hands and go breathe heavily on your grandma.
In order to come down with the disease.
Right.
No,
they don't want you to go breathe on grandma.
They're saying it's slowing down the society coming to an equilibrium with the disease.
Right,
yes.
but they're also saying that the measures that have been pushed are not in keeping with the science.
Yes. I think we should give credit to the organization headquartered in Great Barrington, and that's the American Institute for Economic Research.
Yes.
They sponsored this thing, and it was a good thing for them to do, and they were going to get some heat from it, and
Kudos.
they should get credit for doing it.
Well, the declaration has been attacked viciously,
but not much on the substance. Not on this. They're saying, "Oh, you got money from some. Oh,
yeah.
You're a classical liberal.
Yes.
Oh, it can't be true if it's something said by a classical liberal." Ridiculous.
But it's also that there's the fear-mongering paradigm that progressives are pushing, and the Biden campaign are pushing, and Republicans too, and others, is wrong and can't be substantiated. And I think these scientists are at a point where they can't stand, they're not going to be silent anymore. And they're going to stand up and say, look, this is really what's going on. If you take someone like Scott Atlas from Hoover, who was brought in to be on the coronavirus task force in the White House, he was attacked viciously for basically saying the same things. And he was pointing out these three key epidemiologists as being people that should be consulted with. So, but this, the tendency for this sort of groupthink approach to reality has nothing to do with science. Science is not a consensus-based field, and it reminds us, well, I should mention last February we held a conference here with the National Association of Scholars called Fixing Science, and it was on what's called the irreproducibility crisis, in which different scholars, including ones at Stanford, Ioannidis and others, have pointed out that something in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of peer-reviewed scientific articles are unfounded. They can't be replicated. And so we're finding this in many fields, including the climate issue, and the sort of politically correct pressure, and also the tendency to get grants so that you conform to whatever that doctrine is, has become enormously strong. And the fact that this coronavirus situation has come into existence with this misdirection it's an amazing situation that has gotten totally out of control, that these governors and mayors and so forth essentially have dictatorial control over the lives of millions of people.
And I just want to remind everyone who's with us now that this change on the part of the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization is not in the pocket of some right-wingers. In fact, they realized that the weight of evidence was not in support of the view that they had previously upheld. And so I give credit to those at the World Health Organization for being willing to, publicly shift their view. The mantra about follow the science, believe the science, and so forth, I mean, you can tell this is taking on sort of propagandistic overtones.
Yeah.
There is, of course, more than one form of science, by which I mean more than one form of rigorously founded knowledge. You mentioned, David, that some of the people involved are epidemiologists, but others understand the interaction of health policy with epidemiology. Others understand the intricacies of economic interactions and so forth. We are just publishing this week a piece by our senior fellow, Christopher Coyne from George Mason University, called Infectious Diseases and Government Growth. Now, Christopher Coyne himself has some rigorous knowledge, science, where he looks at the dynamics of the growth of government power in response to health crises over time. And just as a reminder to anybody with us, you can go to independent.org and find this article by Christopher Coyne there on our website. We are also speaking of it sort of informally as an article on virus and Leviathan, just for shorthand. Can you give us briefly what Dr. Coyne's analysis tells us on this, David Theroux?
Well, he's basically talking about the use of the COVID-19 crisis to justify expanded government powers, which are enforced by police powers, which normally would not have been accepted legally, and the harmful effects that can have in setting a new level of intrusiveness, which cannot be defended based on ethics and a constitution and common sense. And what he and his two co-authors have done is they've shown how health crises, pandemics, and so forth have been used in the past, not just in the U.S. but in South Africa and other places, to justify draconian measures, including eugenics and apartheid and many other things. And so this is not a trivial issue. Bill is very helpful in many instances, beyond his normal helpfulness, in pointing out different fiction accounts of some of these matters. And there are numerous novels about the danger of governments running amok because of some pandemic or faux pandemic that's used to justify the seizure of powers over people. And what the Declaration was saying is that, and what the World Health Organization is saying now, is that the cure for the pandemic is far, far worse than the pandemic itself.
Right, yeah.
Not to belittle the fact, I mean, COVID-19 is a real problem.
The lockdown policy.
Right. The lockdown policies, that's right, exactly.
Negative.
Yep. Yes, right.
It may have more of a negative impact on public health.
Yes.
Even.
Right.
And certainly in my field of education policy, it's been very destructive of student learning at both higher education and K-12 levels. And it's going to mean probably unrecoverable loss of learning. So,
man, what a waste, really. You mentioned, David, a little bit ago, the National Association of Scholars, and Bill has just mentioned education. So this brings me to the next thing I wanted to mention to you guys for comment, is that the National Association of Scholars has put together a letter calling for the Pulitzer Prize to be revoked from Nicole Hannah-Jones, who had written the original 1619 project for the New York Times Magazine. Actually, full disclosure, all three of us are signatories to the National Association of Scholars letter. And the reason we all signed it, David, is because, again, if you're concerned about science, rigorously founded knowledge, that 1619 project, which basically says that that America is essentially built fundamentally on slavery, starting in 1619, is full of errors and tendentious ideological assertions, and in fact does not stand as a valid interpretation of history. That was why you signed it, I think, David, right?
Right, but it's not just slavery, it's black slavery.
Yeah.
It's based on black slavery. America was founded to protect and expand black slavery.
It's as its central purpose. Yeah, that's the argument, right. Precisely. Yeah. And that argument has been attacked by a bunch of very reputable historians, including, as I recall, Bill Evers, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Gordon Wood came out against it. Yeah. A group of left-wing historians.
Sean Willits.
McPherson.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
These aren't right-wing people.
No.
These are people who think that history should be told straight and not used ideologically. What I find especially troubling is the 1619 Project. Apparently, some of the material that has been put out by them has removed in recent weeks some of the more offensive phrasing, selectively editing it post facto so as to, I guess, generate less opposition.
I think they're selectively editing it so the essence is there, but things that trigger obvious objections are removed.
Right,
and they did this silently. So normally, if the New York Times makes a correction, it's like a footnote, sort of, okay? So you can see the correction and you can realize that they corrected it. But they did this more like editing in George Orwell's 1984, where the bad is just put down the memory hole and things are silently corrected. And that's really what they did here. And this, various people recognize this, but Phil Magnus, who's an economic historian, specializes in many things, but one of his things is American history surrounding emancipation. And so he noticed this and kicked off a lot of commentary on how bad the New York Times was in doing this cover-up of its correcting and changing and just deceptive practices.
Yeah, Phil had an excellent article in Quillette that really got world attention. Yeah. And the president of the National Association of Scholars, Peter Wood, also has a new short book called 1620 that's just coming out, I think.
In November. Amazon says November.
Okay. And he's calling it 1620 because 1620 was when the Mayflower Compact was written.
Which at one time every American school child knew.
Right. But the issue goes a lot deeper because, as many historians have noted who are experts on slavery and world history and so on, is that slavery has been ubiquitous throughout the world for most of time. And one historian, I forget his name, was pointing out that the exception is not slavery, it's freedom. Freedom is the exception if you look across the span of history and around the world. And in North America, various tribes warred against each other. They would then capture people and enslave them. There was slavery in most places, in the Roman Empire, in Egypt, in India, in China, and Europe, and so on. And so there's even an account that's been written by a number of books of the first slavery that whites had in North America was white slavery. And in fact, the first whites that were brought over to be enslaved was actually in 1618, a year before the Jamestown 20 African, I guess they were brought over from, it wasn't Ghana, I forget, anyway. So the point of the 1619 Project is this critical race theory, which can't be defended based on history and reason. And so it's basically an ideology that they're trying to impose on society for different reasons. And it's important that it be countered. So whether we're talking about Columbus or the Founding Fathers or the opening of the West, so-called, or 1500, 15,000 years before that. Let's try to get to the facts and not make up stories that simply are grist for someone's ideological agenda.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of stunning that some of the most influential institutions in our society seem to be on the train with that kind of approach. It's hard to believe that they're all persuaded by the evidence. I think it seems that it's more probably a matter of style and maybe even fear if you don't affirm what you're supposed to affirm about 1619, etc. Which brings us, as you mentioned a moment ago, finally today to Columbus Day, recently passed. Some people have declared Columbus Day should be called Indigenous Peoples' Day of Rage. And I think the effect of that kind of ideology has been visible in a few places, including recently Portland, which has had a continuous eruption of riots and so forth. Most recently, I think last weekend, rioters in Portland tore down a statue of Abraham Lincoln and tore down a statue of Theodore Roosevelt. I guess they were both considered colonialist oppressors. When is this kind of cultural self-hatred going to abate, Bill Evers, or do you think it will?
Well, as you say, it's an ideological thing, and they're trying to destroy symbols of civilization that they view as inherently evil. They don't really articulate very well what they want to put in its place, but I think we can see that it would be evil and ugly totalitarianism. I noticed that they had a picture of the 21 people who were arrested in Portland one recent night, and they were all wearing black, and they were all white people, although it was supposedly a Black Lives Matter protest.
Young white people.
Yeah.
Were they what we used to call Mercedes Maoists?
I don't know if they own Mercedes or whatever, but they certainly, anyway, they were as I described them. So the mayor of Portland that's in there now, Wheeler, has been allowing a lot of this stuff to go on without really cracking down on it, defending property rights. But he's up for re-election, and he's losing the election. You might think that some defender of property rights and law and civic order would be leading him. The candidate who's leading him is a woman who wears skirts with Mao and Stalin and Che Guevara on her skirt.
Yeah.
Wow.
So she's running to the left of him.
Mm-hmm. And she's ahead, you say?
She's ahead.
My goodness.
But interesting enough, and I'm delighted to see this, is the group that is outspoken against the riots and the destruction in Portland on Columbus Day was the Indian Leaders Roundtable,
Right.
which consists of a number of tribes.
Good for them.
And they consider this behavior to be unconscionable and against everything they stand for.
Mm-hmm.
Increasingly, we're getting black voices that are saying
Exactly.
that this is
Same
counterproductive,
thing, yeah.
destructive,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a tragedy for the merchants and residents of these areas of Portland and the other cities that are suffering from this.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
I can only speculate that as some of this violence and disorder spreads further out into the suburbs, to where the comfortable, insulated, liberals may live, who would like to give air cover and maybe their votes to this kind of ideology from a distance, when it's no longer in a distance, they may feel differently.
It's interesting, we have in the history of classical liberalism a few protest movements. I can think of the Stamp Act controversy.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of the Boston Tea Party.
I'm in favor of them.
So with the Stamp Act crisis, they did, treat the Stamp Act collectors pretty harshly, but they were careful not to trample the flowers of their houses when they were coming to protest. Similarly, with the Boston Tea Party, any the protesters who, seized the tea and dumped it in the harbor. But if they were caught trying to take any of the tea for themselves, they were dumped in the harbor.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
So, what we're looking at here is not very well disciplined protest, as well as being protests for very unfortunate ends.
So 2 weeks from today, gentlemen, we will get back together again for another discussion of the independent outlook. By then, a number of things will have happened. Apparently on the 22nd next week, we will have had the Judiciary Committee vote on Amy Coney Barrett, and then the full Senate, according to Senator McConnell, is going to be voting on the 27th last time I saw this, so that'll be right before we get together again. So looking ahead, do you think that by the time the full Senate votes on Amy Coney Barrett, that any Democrats will vote for her? Bill, what do you think?
Yes, I do think that.
Okay, give me a number.
A very few.
A very few. That sounds like three.
Two
That
or
sounds
three,
like three.
maybe.
Okay.
The senator from West Virginia.
Yeah, I predict two.
A few out there that will do it.
Okay,
but
David Theroux says two.
Overwhelming majority not. It will be nothing like Ginsburg's.
No. She had what?
She had 96. Yeah, something
right.
like that.
Yeah, unbelievable. Okay, so we're all saying, myself included, that there's going to get David says two, Bill says three. I might even go as far as four, because I do think there's a certain salutary fallout from her good demeanor in that committee, which, may pull some of the reasonable people in.
She has been a model.
Yes. Oh, she really has. Yeah, you got to give her credit.
And not just a model as a prospective associate justice. She's presenting herself as a model human being.
Yes, right.
And a role model for women.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And so, this thing about attacking her for being, handmaiden, whatever, she is the exact opposite of that. I mean, the family, and she's been a professor, and so on. By the way, one other thing I was going to just throw in is that I don't want people to despair about the fact that in 2020 we've had these riots and all this other crazy stuff going on, because in many respects, in my opinion, what we're seeing is the standing of progressivism as a civic creed, i.e., that some elite based on science or whatever should run society, and that the average person should be lorded over for their own good, is cracking up. Mm-hmm. And the people who have believed in it or have had positions of control and power and so forth are losing control of the conversation. And so they're getting more and more desperate. And so the basic progressive approach is an authoritarian approach. So there's no reason why you would not justify rioting or whatever, because if you can, the end justifies the means to do that, you're going to pursue it. So I think that we should take stock of the fact that more and more people are aware of the fallacies of this sort of progressive ideology, as far as progressive cities are a mess, the schools are falling apart, the COVID-19's been led by a progressive ideology. Every issue you can think of that is really gone awry is being led by this mistaken viewpoint, the economy, whatever. And where you have areas in which you reduce control, reduce taxes, reduce regulation, give people more choice and to be accountable and be able to benefit from their own actions, you see the opposite. So I think that obviously the turmoil is not going to stop, certainly in the near term, but I do think it's important to see that there is, the reason why we're going through this is because this viewpoint no longer has the traction that it once did.
That's right.
And I think that's a good sign.
Yeah.
And we certainly want a sense of a healthy culture, decent behavior, nobility of spirit to flow into those open spaces as freedom gets expanded.
Yeah.
The progressives sometimes, in order to advance their power, have advocated things that are really not healthy for the society. And we hope that people are resilient enough to stand that off.
Well,
Absolutely.
the origin of the 1619 Project really goes back to the Frankfurt School, which was, their view when they emigrated to the United States was to attack so-called bourgeois West, the freedom, the family, tradition, the rule of law, and the idea was to undermine that for essentially Marxist purposes. Something that Marx wouldn't have believed in himself, by the way. But I do think that there is, a positive development, and being an advocate of natural law, I do think that there is a factor that will flow in when people are given responsibility, and that these institutions can recover because of that. And it isn't just a blank slate necessarily. People learn that the riots in Minneapolis and Rochester and whatever are a disaster. And it's unfortunate that these kinds of things happen, but when you have a creed that says, as I described the progressive approach, reigning for decades, 100 years, then we sometimes have to go through what Jefferson talked about of restoring liberty.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And just remember, friends who have joined us from far and near, this is probably one of the few places here at the Independent Institute where you will hear discussion about the need for nobility of spirit.
Yeah.
And the availability of naturally available moral reasoning, the natural law, and coupled with practical solutions to a lot of problems that really are available once people start looking around. So also on that note, let me remind our friends that if you want to tune in on Friday, we are going to have another live stream specifically with Dr. Christopher Coyne on that article I mentioned earlier, Infectious Diseases and Government Growth. That's going to be at 1 p.m. Pacific time on Friday this week, coming to you from the Independent Institute. So with that, I think I'll say thank you to Bill Evers.
Thank you.
Thank you to David Theroux.
Thank you.
Thank you to ThinkSpot, all our friends who've joined us through the ThinkSpot platform, and all of those around the country who want to have an independent outlook on the news of the day. See you next time.